Well, here's I'm a little bit on of a immigration rant of sorts. Wasn't really fully my intention, but I had interesting things happen to me online where I got a lot of interesting feedback on my last video, and part of it, one person did not understand where I could possibly be coming from in such a way to understand why a libertarian would move away from a pure open borders point of view. And I said something to the effect of, well, the last 4 years forced me to kind of rethink things. And the gentleman claimed to have no idea what I was talking about in reference to the last 4 years. So I decided to kind of tear into some of the things Cato has been saying on things in terms of immigration. Just so you know, I do actually find Cato to be a very good resource. They're not as good as they once were. I think a lot of it has to do with certain benefactors of theirs skewing how they interpret and what's important to the institute. So essentially, what we would get from a lot of what comes out of Cato, the Cato Institute, loves mass migration, and they think you should too. Now, there's a cadre of libertarians who are not in any way impacted by how immigration has been handled in the past 4 years. In other words, they've stayed at an open borders position, whereas I've shifted away from it. Now, because of this, I decided to break down the Cato view even further. They routinely assert studies that show legal immigrants commit less crime than Americans native to the US. And these studies have a lot of issues. The first is policing issues in large cities. A lot of these cities often direct the police to overlook illegal immigrant crimes, and many local DAs fail to convict. Some of this is uh, sanctuary city type stuff, and some of it's just the whole DAs who think they need to rectify uh, crime based on statistical racial breakdowns, TI stuff. So then you also have an issue with categorization. Many locations don't categorize uh, immigration status at all. Some, like the cities I just mentioned, deliberately don't report status in order to avoid tipping off ICE. Some places do it very haphazardly where they don't have a decent system in place. There's often miscategorizations or supplemental categorizations that are not in the records. What I mean by supplemental, what happens is they may discover along the line later that somebody is an immigrant, illegal immigrant specifically. So they may be arrested with no categorization, but later on, when they're going through the process, they may decide that and it gets tacked on later. So people looking purely at arrest records might miss that. And that's a favorite trick of our data people because they know the arrest records are going to be less thorough than the records of people who actually make it into the system in some form of trial, etc. And then there's a really big issue of non reporting. Illegal on illegal crime is not nearly as likely to be reported as other crimes. Basically, people trying to basically keep their heads down and avoid the system. Now, Cato favors a report covering Texas statistics, and the Texas Department of Safety does have a very deserved reputation for record keeping. The Texas Department of Safety does track immigration status of arrestees and charged individuals and convictions. However, they themselves note that there are issues with lack of status or wrong status as you work your way up that chain. So if you pick arrests as your primary metric, you're actually going to have the least reliable chunk of the data in terms of determining who is an illegal immigrant and who's not. Depending on what stage the study samples impacts the accuracy of the data. At the time of the Cato study, 3 large Texas cities were sanctuary cities. This was banned as of 2025. How it actually comes into implementation, we still don't know, but this predates this to where sanctuary cities in Texas were functioning fully as sanctuary cities. The existence of sanctuary city policies corrupts the data. Houston has been plagued by chronic manpower shortages. Data for this city is spotty at best, even for the Texas records. As Texas tends to have a law and order reputation, uh, it's a little bit different than a lot of other states. And the fact that it's a border state makes it even more different. So, if we even look at the quality of the data and say it can properly be rendered, it's unlikely that Texas can function as a proxy for the entire United States. Even with no special caveats, using any state as a proxy for the whole is a poor application of the data. Another Cato assertion is that Americans actually love mass migration. And their evidence is, well, we buy and sell with immigrants. We rent to them. We hire them. Proof. Well, this is absolutely silly. The inference here is that we all know one when we see one. So, Nigerian illegal immigrants wandering through Walmart are theirs because Walmart has a policy where they say, yes, we want Nigerian illegal immigrants in our store. That's just stupid. And the stupidity of this transactional argument should really drop Cato's credibility on the immigration issue a great deal. Cato uses a fantasyland argument that assumes that every immigrant arrives here as an enthusiastic worker. In the age before our welfare state, this was almost certainly true. Immigrants in that earlier era came with zero expectations of support, except perhaps maybe family and ethnic communities that had arrived ahead of them. They knew they were going to have to work. They knew they would have to prepare for old age. Yes, Cato, those old-timey halcyon days are long gone. We know for a fact that NGOs are in foreign countries recruiting people. So these people aren't people who are all just going, wow, we were really wanted to come here. Well, now we're coming because we know someone's going to handhold us all the way there. Very different from our Ellis Island counterparts that showed up in the late 1800s. And we know for a fact that these same NGOs are telling recruits that there are plenty of jobs for them, as well as government benefits. We know for a fact that the NGOs are helping them fill out benefit forms. Cato then says, but immigrants are on less government assistance than American citizens. First, not true. Because as Cato tends to do, they conflate illegals with legal immigrants, especially when it gives them the answer they want. And then they separate illegals and legals when it doesn't give them the answer they want. So the question is, so what if immigrants are on welfare programs, but not as much as Americans? I don't think Americans are interested in an immigration policy that results in anybody coming to the US and receiving assistance. The idea of deliberately bringing in people who need to go on government assistance is ludicrous. It's a stupid idea. Another Cato assertion is that immigration is economically balancing. This is the idea that there's a market force out there that drives immigration, thus preventing it from getting out of hand. In addition to the problems of NGOs and government welfare programs, there's also a wage gap between the US and other countries. The average US wages are 5 times greater than those in South America, 8 times greater than those in Africa, and 4 times greater than those in Asia. And just keep in mind that the Asian numbers are probably worse if you take out Japan for sure and definitely China. A lot of the rest of Asia hasn't caught up yet. And sorry, Korea too. You're my friend. So presumably, these immigrants would stop coming when the ratios get closer to 1 to 1. Do we really want that to happen? Which is more likely to happen with an open border or close to an open immigration? Would our wages be more likely to go down, or would the target continent's wages go up? I think the answer is pretty clear that it's more likely that our wages would go down. Maybe not as real numbers, but in actual purchasing power over time. Or, in other words, then we may get more dollars per hour, but it's going to be buying less. There are some valid arguments where falling wages and increased production can raise standard of living. This very thing happened to us in the 1800s. However, that can't happen with massive debt, federal deficit spending, and generous social programs. Heck, even ungenerous social programs are a problem. If there is an economic signal for immigration, it can't work under these current conditions. And in all honesty, I don't think that signal exists. And what I mean by signal is prices. Everything else in terms of the free market works on prices. Prices tell you when you should make more of something and when you should make less. I don't believe the price exists that controls immigration. At least not a price you want to come to. There's an even bigger problem. What about people fleeing crap hole nations? Maybe it's a country that's got problems with war, crime, endemic poverty, civil unrest. The problem here is far worse than dealing with low wages. These people will continue to come as long as our society is less of a crap hole than theirs. In short, there is literally no existing economic signal here that would stop people from coming to the United States. Another top 10 Cato assertion is that immigrants are indeed a net negative to the economic accounting sheet, but that negative balance is balanced out when the children of the immigrants reach adulthood. So, and there may be some truth to this, but the fun part about this is Cato doesn't seem to realize the implication of this assertion, if it's true. This infers a threshold, call it a carrying capacity. If each immigrant family is a 2 to 20 year net drain that breaks even after a few decades, once their children reach adulthood, it means if we take too many immigrants in, it will lower our standard of living. Cato has, in fact, made a powerful argument for limiting immigration for the good of the overall population. Cato mentions the idea of having a Ellis Island style system as being a better option than we have now. They are, of course, overly vague about how this would work. When Dave gave Alex a push on the last debate, he just kind of, without really giving any details at all. So, the first issue illustrates a couple of problems. In the late 1800s, coming to the US across the Atlantic would cost the equivalent of 10% of a family's annual wages. That's one person. It would be an additional 10% for each family member being brought over. And that's just basically based on how much people were making overseas, based on what the cost of passage over the Atlantic was. Today, coming to the US costs less than 1% of a family's annual wage. Price was part of the barrier to entry, which made the old Ellis Island system work better by keeping migration more manageable. The cost to entry would also be a major investment, meaning the person had a lot of skin in the games in terms of immigrating, unlike people who would be coming today. More problems with an Ellis Island system is that it would require a large expansion of the immigration facilities at every port of entry. Um, this is something where they would have to plan for, might include multi-day stayovers. They might need mass uh, detention facilities to deal with surges. Because we need to screen, basically looking for criminals, looking for terrorists, looking for people with medical conditions, it would mean you would still have a border problem. So, whatever screening process you had, whatever the exclusions were, would cause people who knew they were going to be excluded to illegally cross at the border anyway. So, as long as there is a near universal policy of letting people in, the numbers coming will not drop. An Ellis Island system will still cost a great deal, but we'll still have the same issues with immigration. Another thing that people love to assert is the idea that immigrants do the jobs Americans won't. Now, I'm going to steal some notes from a Tucker Carlson interview on this topic. Um, Another way of saying that Americans won't do certain jobs is to say that certain Americans aren't worth the effort of being prepared for a job. Our welfare programs make it easier to live in squalor than to do work and be, to work hard and be poor. Um, this is because better alternatives, because people working are more likely to see opportunities climbing up a rung. Let me restate that because that didn't come out the way I intended. Okay, so if you don't have a welfare program, people will work at the low end jobs. Some of them will be happy to stay there, but some of them will say, hey, if I work a little harder, I might be able to get to a better spot. Maybe opportunities come up that allow them to climb up a rung. Whereas somebody who's comfortable on welfare, even if they're living in horrible conditions, don't get those opportunities. They don't feel the whole work experience as much. Therefore, they're less likely to get themselves out of a bad position. So, one of the things that welfare causes is because it encourages people not to work, it makes immigrant workers theoretically necessary. It's not that the Americans won't do the job, it's they might not do the job if they're given an alternative of working for nothing or working and receiving money for doing nothing. But here's where the immigration story starts to get a little ugly. Marginal workers, talking about Americans, who may need help getting to work, are now priced out of jobs by immigrants who are ready to work. A factory or farm short of workers might decide to invest in shuttle buses to help bring workers in from the city who lack transport, but not if low cost immigrants are already there to do the job. In fact, in a lot of cases, immigrants are pretty much almost living on the premises. Why would you hire Americans in a city and bus them to work when you basically got people living in barracks and tents on your property doing the work already, i.e., like packing plants and some of the agricultural stuff. Companies might be willing to set up programs to assist Americans with learning issues or knowledge deficiency, but not if they have cheap immigrants to fill the position. Why make the extra effort that costs something if you already got somebody willing to step up and do the job? A company looking for labor might be willing to set up programs to help rehabilitate criminals, but they're never going to have to do this if they have a workforce of laborers who are already inexpensive. Companies looking for workers might pay to rehabilitate the handicapped, the mentally ill, and the addicted, but those costs are very high compared to someone who just showed up over the border who's willing to work for a lot less, someone who's willing to work for entry level or lower wages. Another problem is labor shortages drive automation. Growing your population via immigration alters the economic calculus. Why automate when you have cheap labor? So, what are we missing out on by giving US businesses cheap labor as a subsidy? It encourages them not to automate. Then, when the production equipment gets too old to maintain, or it's producing low quality goods compared to their automated counterparts overseas, well, the logical thing is to just move your factories overseas at that point. So, oddly enough, not only are immigrants crowding Americans out of jobs that they might take under a desperate circumstance, ultimately, immigrants force jobs overseas once our factories start getting to the point where things need to be replaced. Immigration may have contributed to the deindustrialization of the US. I'm not saying it's a primary cause, I'm saying it's a contributor. What about American culture? Now, to someone who's been infected with neoliberal thoughts, like Cato, the United States has no culture. So, therefore, people are reduced to production units that can be plucked from one country to another. I think I'm going to get into the culture thing in another video, but I'll stop on that part. So, does this mean I'm anti immigration? No, not at all. I recognize that there's great value in immigration. Unlike Cato, I can also see that it's not an ultimate good. In other words, its benefits are not so great that they nullify the downsides of immigration. Because there are mitigating factors, there needs to be massive changes in how the US approaches entitlements before the process of immigration can be opened more. So, in fact, I would be open to the idea of something looking like their Ellis Island idea if our entitlement system was greatly changed. In fact, I actually believe there is a solid case for open immigration. However, it can't be attempted while the US is structured the way it currently is because immigration's good does not overcome these structural defects. All right. So, in the comments below, how many of these Cato arguments have you heard elsewhere? Because most people who uh, either push open borders, or push for mass immigration dip into the same studies and numbers. Uh, what do you think the solution is for the near term? Do you think I'm correct that there is no way to run an open immigration system as long as we have an entitlement system, a welfare state? If you disagree with what I'm saying, let me know in the comments. Tell me why somehow all these things I was just laying out don't work. And in all honesty, I think the strongest argument is the one about immigrant children, once they reach adulthood, brings that family into net balance in terms of expenditures. Because if that is the case, which it definitely, which I'll accept that Cato number, but I suspect it's even worse than that. I suspect their children have to be not just merely starting adults, but probably somewhere mid into their adulthood before this actually happens. But the point being is, as long as you keep adding every year, you're eventually going to exceed your ability to keep sopping this up. And if you do, well, the result is going to be at least a slowing down of the growth of the economy. And at some point, it's got to result in loss of standard of living. So if you have a counter argument to that, I'd love to hear it and tell me why Cato's wrong, because Cato is the one who made the assertion. Please smash the like button. Uh, if the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please look at my other titles. You will find something you like. It's worth subscribing. And also, if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.